This is the third video in the Ski Goggles product adventure. Today I'll be going over my prep for customer interviews for a goggle case study. The prep includes figuring out the logistics for the interviews and creating an interview guide. For the logistics, to get a bunch of interviews, I'm going to go skiing and use the singles line. And in case you aren't familiar with skiing, the singles line is not a dating app. It's a specific line skiers wait in when they're skiing alone. Chairlifts, the things that take you up the mountain, may have, for example, room for 4 people. If you've got a group of 3 skiers, someone from the single line will join them for the ride up the lift. I'll use the time going up the mountain to ask people about goggles. Now, ethnography, which is watching the users in actual use environment, is the Vibranium standard. So I'll mix a bit of that in as well. I really should spend a lot more time doing it, but while you're awesome and everything, I'm not going to bail on an entire day of skiing for a fake case study. It would totally throw off the work-life ski balance. So I'll give you a little tidbit about ethnography instead. You may have read The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. And if you haven't, why not? Anyway, in it, he talks about the lean concept of Genchi Genbutsu. It's a Japanese term that translates to go and see for yourself. If you want a phrase that's easier to remember, the version I learned in Lean and in Design for Six Sigma was go to Gemba. Gemba translates to the actual place. So go to the actual place. Go to Gemba. Okay, so how many interviews do we need? Generally, we want a dozen or more interviews per segment. But alas, you say we haven't done segmentation yet. You're right. So we'll take a stab at it and we'll iterate on our understanding of the segments and the user needs, just like we iterate on the design. I touched upon this in the previous video. Iterations happen from fuzzy front end all the way through to product retirement. Thinking through the interview, recruitment, and environment, I want to look for potential biases. The first thing that comes to mind is potential pre-segmentation based on what chairlift I'm going to ride. This is because different chairlifts service different parts of the mountain and therefore different skier experience levels. Less experienced skiers are going to be riding the lifts that service the easier ski trails. Also, different ski areas attract different types of skiers. Some mountains are more challenging than others. Some ski areas are known as the mountain the locals ski at, while some are known more for their après-ski, aka after-ski partying, than their actual skiing. Some biases you can just accept, or even have them work to your advantage. So, for example, I'm going to stick to chairlifts servicing the more challenging terrain because people who ski more often are going to purchase more goggles, basically just by definition. I'd also guess they're going to spend more on each goggle purchase, but that's an assumption that we need to validate. Some biases you can't just accept. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if I were to get different responses in the morning versus the afternoon. Some folks just ski in the morning, others just in the afternoon. So I'll need to make sure I interview throughout the day to compensate for that. And I should probably make note of the times for crosstabs. It'll help with analysis. I'm going to be using 3 chairlifts and 1 gondola. The rides range from 7.5 minutes to 9 minutes. That short amount of time won't allow much, if any really, time for me to ask questions to get information about those potential biases. Further, I won't have a silent observer nor a scribe that could look for the nonverbal communication. So I'll just need to keep that in mind and, when possible, use follow-up questions to at least partially get that info. For example, if someone says, "Kids these days have it easy with their goggle straps," my follow-up might be, if you think back across how long you've been skiing, what changes have you noticed in goggle straps? In their response, they're likely to include how long they've been skiing. In the example I just gave, the person is pretty much begging to tell you how long they've been skiing. And anytime a customer is looking for an opportunity to tell you something, give them the opportunity. Sometimes, for whatever reason, customers, users feel they need permission to tell you something. You need to learn to read that and provide that permission. And often you need to do it subtly. There's a reason why they feel they need permission. So why not just ask them how long they've been skiing? Well, our job is to get them to open up about their problems, and quick factual Q&A is much less engaging for them. And we also don't want to set the tone early that we're looking for short answers. The ideal customer interview script is one that never gets completely used because it engages the interviewee so much in the topic area that they just talk the entire time. I mostly don't care if they cover my specific questions. If they're talking about things that are important to them, that's the vibranium. That's not to say there won't be some steering that needs to happen. Like, for example, if they start to go into solution space, you need to steer them to the underlying needs with something like, oh, well, that sounds cool. In what ways would that help you? Get to that underlying needs. The main part of the interview guide is a set of questions. Main questions and potential follow-up questions. I also like to include reminders to myself, like sometimes I include the goal of the interviews. Sometimes there are scripts as well in there, legal stuff, maybe product premise. Regardless, test your interview guides. Draft the guidance, read the questions out loud to a colleague, then revise and fix all the awkward and unclear things, and then repeat it until it's clear to that colleague. And then do the same thing again with other colleagues. Then do it again with a sample of users or simulated users. Repeat. Then, after all that, it's ready. Maybe. Of course, all the while you should be ensuring that you're not leading the user and you're minimizing bias as much as possible. For the goggles, I did this, substituting some skier friends I know for the colleagues. Then I used a recent ski day to try out the questions a bit and didn't collect any data. It's really tempting to collect data when testing out the questions, but don't. I'll give you an example of a revision I needed to make. Because I'm not setting the interviews up ahead of time, I had this extra step of having to ask them if it's okay to ask them some questions. I consider asking things like, how are those goggles? Just sort of casual conversation. But that would likely lead to biased results because some people will feel the need to defend their purchase. So after a few rounds with my skier friends, I landed on an intro of, I'm doing a little research. Do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions about your experience with ski goggles? It was clear and relatively concise. However, when I tried it out on a couple skiers on the lift, one person responded by asking if I was working for a company making ski goggles, which turned the focus of the conversation onto me, which is not what you want. Getting back to the length of the ride, I've learned through experience that I can get no more than 3 main questions in 50 minutes or 2 main questions in a half an hour. Of course, the trick is getting as much as you can in, but without the interviewee feeling the slightest bit rushed. And really, you want your questions to follow a natural arc, so ideally the whole thing feels like a natural conversation. Since the chairlift rides are short, I'm only going to get 1 main question in. The drawback is that I won't be able to dive deep into multiple areas, with any one user. But the benefit is that it should be pretty easy to have one fluid conversation. I'll wrap up with 5 tips to avoid common fails. A good goal is to have them be talking at least 80% of the time. Don't use why questions. It's really easy for them to sound accusatory. Instead, ask them something like, what makes that important? Every time I read or hear someone recommending using the 5 whys technique, I think to myself, they couldn't possibly have conducted many user interviews. Either that or their delivery is phenomenal. Not only are they why questions, the back and forth is like an interrogation. I don't want to be talking that much, and I certainly don't want to spend 5 questions on it. And if it takes 5 questions, by the way, to get to their base need, you should probably start interviewing humans and not an AI bot. Use silence effectively. If you're quiet and give them a good and safe vibe, they're likely to fill the silence with valuable information. Don't sell. Learn to get comfortable and just hanging out in their pain. Product people like you and I are problem solvers, and we want to make things better for people, but we're looking for unmet needs, and solving their problem is just going to get in the way. Instead, we have to empathize with them. Often users will think something's important, but boring to the rest of the world. You want to know those things, but they might be hesitant to tell you them for fear of looking silly. I like to say, if something's important to you, it's important to me. Please tell me about it, even if you think it's small or boring. That's it for now. Please like and subscribe. Talk to you later. So it's kind of like a movie trilogy where all the OG fans get pissed off when the 4th and 5th movies come out. Hopefully by the 6th movie, a new director will come in and bring back the original feel of the franchise.